Welcome back, everyone, to Hidden History Stories. In today's episode, we're setting sail with England's most feared sea captain, Sir Francis Drake, and following him on the ill-fated voyage that would end his legendary career. This is the tale of daring raids, deadly battles, and a man who discovered too late that even legends can fall. Every story from the past holds a lesson, and this one reveals how courage alone cannot defeat disease, changing tactics, and the march of time. But before we cast off, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and share it with anyone who loves exploring the past. And tell me in the comments, what is your favorite historical era? Your support keeps these stories alive. Now, let's begin. The Caribbean sun blazed mercilessly on the deck of the Defiance as Sir Francis Drake studied the charts spread before him. It was January 1596, and England's most feared sea captain was planning what would become his final assault on the Spanish colonial empire. At 55, Drake's weathered face bore the scars of countless battles, his eyes still sharp with the cunning that had made him a legend throughout Europe and a nightmare to Spanish colonists across the Americas. Beside him stood Sir John Hawkins, his longtime companion in privateering ventures, now 63 and feeling every year of his age in the tropical heat. The two men had transformed English naval warfare, pioneering the hit-and-run tactics that would plague Spanish treasure fleets for decades. But this voyage felt different, more desperate, more final. Queen Elizabeth's England was locked in a death struggle with Philip II's Spain, and the outcome of their colonial conflict would determine which nation would dominate the emerging Atlantic world. Drake's fleet of 27 ships represented the largest English naval expedition yet sent to the Caribbean. The plan was audacious even by Drake's standards. Strike simultaneously at the great Spanish strongholds of Las Palmas in the Canaries, then cross the Atlantic to devastate Puerto Rico, Cartagena, and Panama itself, the vital link in Spain's treasure route from Peru. Success would cripple Spanish colonial power and fill Elizabeth's war chest with enough silver to continue the fight against the Catholic superpower. The first target was Las Palmas, where Spanish ships regularly stopped to resupply before crossing to the Americas. But as Drake's fleet approached the Canary Islands, disaster struck. Spanish lookouts had spotted the English ships days earlier, and the island's governor had prepared a devastating trap. When Drake's men attempted their amphibious assault on October 6, 1595, they walked into a carefully orchestrated ambush. Spanish soldiers had positioned themselves in the stone buildings overlooking the harbor, their muskets loaded and ready. As English sailors waded through the surf, carrying their heavy matchlock weapons and steel breastplates, volleys of gunfire erupted from every window and rooftop. The narrow beach became a killing ground, littered with English dead and dying. Drake himself barely escaped, his own boat struck by cannon fire as he retreated to his flagship. The failure at Las Palmas was more than a tactical defeat. It revealed that Spain's colonial defenses had evolved dramatically since Drake's earlier successes. Gone were the days when a swift English assault could overwhelm surprised Spanish garrisons. The colonial authorities had learned hard lessons from decades of English raids, transforming their ports into fortress cities bristling with artillery and professional soldiers. Undeterred by the setback, Drake ordered his fleet westward across the Atlantic. The crossing took 6 grueling weeks, with storms battering the ships and tropical diseases beginning their deadly work among the crews. Hawkins, already weakened by years at sea, fell gravely ill during the voyage. On November 12th, as the fleet anchored off Puerto Rico, the old privateer died in his cabin aboard the Garland, leaving Drake to face their greatest challenge alone. Puerto Rico presented a formidable target. The Spanish had transformed San Juan into one of the strongest fortresses in the Americas, with massive stone walls, dozens of cannon, and a garrison of veteran soldiers. But Drake knew the harbor's layout intimately from his previous raids, and he believed speed and surprise could still overcome Spanish preparations. The English attack began at dawn on November 22, with Drake leading a flotilla of small boats toward the harbor mouth. The plan required perfect timing. While Drake's boats drew Spanish fire, the main fleet would sail past the fortress guns and land troops behind the city's defenses. But the Spanish commander, Don Pedro Tello, had anticipated exactly such a strategy. As Drake's boats approached, Spanish artillery opened fire with devastating accuracy. The first salvo shattered 2 English launches, sending dozens of men into the shark-infested waters. Drake's own flagship, the Defiance, took a direct hit that killed several officers standing near the helm. Realizing the attack was doomed, Drake signaled the retreat, but not before Spanish gunners had inflicted terrible casualties on his fleet. The failure at Puerto Rico forced Drake to reconsider his entire strategy. The old tactics of overwhelming assault were clearly obsolete against Spain's improved defenses. Instead, he decided to adopt a more subtle approach, targeting smaller settlements and isolated treasure shipments while avoiding heavily fortified ports. The fleet sailed westward to the coast of modern-day Colombia, where Drake hoped to intercept Spanish treasure convoys traveling from the interior mines to Cartagena. Near the mouth of the Magdalena River, English scouts reported a Spanish settlement called Rio de la Hacha, supposedly weakly defended and rich in pearls and gold accumulated from local trade. The assault on Rio de la Hacha began before dawn on December 15th, with English sailors rowing silently through the mangrove swamps that surrounded the settlement. This time, Drake's intelligence proved accurate. The Spanish garrison consisted of only 30 soldiers, commanded by a local merchant who had never faced a serious military threat. Within hours, English forces had overrun the settlement's defenses and began systematically looting every building. But the victory came at a terrible cost. The tropical climate was devastating Drake's crews faster than Spanish bullets. Yellow fever, dysentery, and malaria spread through the fleet like wildfire, killing dozens of men daily. Ships that had left England with full crews now struggled to maintain skeleton watches. Drake himself showed signs of the tropical sickness that would soon claim his life. The fleet's final major action came at Nombre de Dios, the Pacific terminus of Spain's treasure route across the Panamanian Isthmus. Drake had attacked this same port 24 years earlier in one of his most famous victories, but now the Spanish were ready for him. Governor Don Alonso de Sotomayor had reinforced the port's defenses and stationed cavalry units along the jungle trails that English raiders traditionally used to approach the city. When Drake's men landed on January 9th, 1596, they found themselves facing not confused Spanish colonists, but disciplined soldiers with modern weapons and tactical training. The English assault bogged down in the muddy streets of Nombre de Dios, with Spanish defenders fighting from house to house while cavalry units harassed English flanks. After 3 days of brutal urban warfare, Drake was forced to withdraw with minimal plunder and heavy casualties. The retreat from Nombre de Dios marked the effective end of Drake's career as a privateer. His health deteriorating rapidly from tropical fever, he could barely leave his cabin as the English fleet sailed eastward along the Central American coast. On January 27, 1596, off the coast of modern-day Panama, Francis Drake died in his bunk aboard the Defiance, his body racked by the same diseases that had claimed hundreds of his men. Drake's death symbolized more than the end of one man's remarkable career. It marked the conclusion of the first great age of English privateering in the Americas, when individual captains could challenge Spanish colonial power through personal courage and tactical brilliance. The Spanish Empire had adapted to the English threat, transforming its colonial defenses and developing new strategies to protect its treasure routes. The surviving English ships limped back across the Atlantic, carrying news of Drake's death to a queen who would herself die 7 years later, ending the Elizabethan age that had produced England's first generation of oceanic adventurers. But Drake's legacy lived on in the English naval tradition, inspiring future generations of captains who would ultimately succeed where he had failed, building the global empire that Drake had dreamed of but never lived to see. The Spanish colonists celebrated Drake's death throughout their American territories, holding special masses and festivals to mark the end of their greatest tormentor. But they also understood that his death represented not victory, but merely a pause in the larger struggle for control of the Atlantic world. Other English captains would follow, armed with better ships, improved tactics, and the bitter lessons learned from Drake's final, failed voyage. The battle for the Spanish Main would continue for centuries, shaping the destiny of nations and the lives of millions of people across the Americas. Drake's last voyage had failed in its immediate objectives, but it had demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of European colonial warfare in the Age of Sail, when individual courage could challenge empires but could not overcome the fundamental realities of geography, disease, and technological change that would ultimately determine which European powers would dominate the New World. That was the end of the story of Sir Francis Drake, the legendary sea captain whose final voyage showed that even the greatest heroes cannot escape time, disease, and changing tides of war. If you found this story fascinating, remember to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss more hidden history stories.